So recently, I just finished a biography on Ulysses S. Grant by Ron Chernow. Chernow is a fairly, I think, well-regarded author when it comes to biography, having another famous one on Alexander Hamilton, maybe a few others. And I was really interested to have a look at Grant. I think I've talked about in some of my videos on history. If you're trying to learn about a period of history, it's good to focus on a particular period, but sometimes to learn about a period in its broader contexts, it can really help to read biographies about people who are involved in that area, because in the course of then their life, you kind of get a scope of what was going on before and what was going on after. So for someone like Grant, he's kind of unusual. He's one of the very few people who, although he was a two-term president of the United States, and what I learned from this book, a near three-term president, um, he's one of the few figures who is much more famous probably for his non-presidential accomplishments. The only other two I think that are pretty obvious would be maybe George Washington and maybe Dwight Eisenhower. But Grant's role as the lieutenant general in the Civil War is probably uh, certainly considered more important in hindsight, and he's certainly more famous as a Civil War general than he was as a president. But if we use that as an example, the Civil War, I've always been very fascinated with the Civil War, what led up to it, how did we get to this point, and of course how it was actually waged, how it was fought, the battles, all the details there. And what I found really refreshing about this book, and I'm not going to review the book so much here, although I will recommend it's excellent, is that so much of our understanding of history is based on these focusing on particular episodes, almost to the exclusion of almost everything else. So in the case of the United States, there's a lot of history about World War II. There's a lot of history about the Civil War and the American Revolution. And then intervening periods, even though there's a ton of history that's written about them, right? We do have a lot of information about the period between the American Revolution and the Civil War. It's not like a dark age for which we lack primary documents or secondary documents or authors who write about it. We don't. We have a ton. But within the popular zeitgeist, within the narrative of our society, that stuff is largely absent, almost completely. And this allows for some what I would call fairy tales to come to light. So the Civil War, understandably, is considered this watershed event, maybe the watershed event in American history, and it's a very pivotal, fundamental, momentous thing. And there's so many. I've read so many books on the Civil War, but what ends up happening is those books will end with Appomattox or the assassination of Lincoln, and then there'll be a prologue, there'll be or a eulogy, an epilogue that might mention, a little bit of what happened later, and you might get little wrap-up biographies. So, for instance, many of them would probably mention, oh well, Grant went on to become a two-term president, uh, but won't go into many details. Nothing about his actual, terms of office or how he became president or anything after that. So, one thing I really liked about the Chernow book is that it really covers the span of his life. I think he died in 1885. Uh, he was born, I think, in the 1830s, I want to say, early 1830s. And so you get kind of the the perspective of somebody who lived through the Civil War generation, what they grew up, what it was like, coming of age in the time of the Mexican War, and then the lead up to the Civil War, and then the Civil War itself. And a lot is spent on the Civil War, but I think by the time the Civil War ends in the book, there's still about only two-thirds through the book. So like a third of the book covers Reconstruction. And I think that this has really got me thinking. I've been interested in Reconstruction for a while, but I'll be honest, I haven't read too many books about it. I have an entire shelf dedicated to Reconstruction that I haven't really touched too much. I knew some of the details, but this book on Grant really, really ironed out kind of a basic outline of it. So uh, the myth here, the fairy tale, is that we have this racist South, the slave owning racist South, and then we get into a civil war because of slavery. Uh, which that's a very simplistic way to look at it, but not necessarily wrong. But it wasn't a case of the North saying, we want to free the slaves, so we are going to attack the South. It was a case of, we are nationalistic and we don't want the South to leave. We want there to be one nation, and we are going to attack the South. And in the course of the war, as a war measure, as a punishment for secession, we are going to inflict emancipation on the South, uh, along with the fact that the war itself is going to do a lot to harm slavery. And then we have the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, and then Lincoln dies as this martyr, and all the slaves get free, and holy cow, wasn't this great thing? And now we have this lesson that the federal government is this wonderful institution that can sweep in and do all this good. It can do this wonderful thing, ending slavery. Uh, Not too many people quibble about the fact that it involved a war that killed. People have been saying 680,000 for years. They've recently come up with new estimates that increase that into the 800,000s. Uh, but whatever, that is this good thing. Of course, then people learn in other history that we have the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and there's about a 100-year gap there, and I think it was fair to ask, well, wait a second, I thought that the federal government, you know, solved this problem during the Civil War, and people with public school educations can be forgiven for maybe not remembering the dates of the Civil War and the Civil Rights Act. But there was a period after the Civil War it's now called Reconstruction. This was, how are we going to reintegrate these southern states that have been brought back into the Union by force, by conquest. Another interesting kind of term, Shelby Foote pointed out in the Civil War documentary by Ken Burns, that prior to the Civil War, it was always said the United States are, and then after it became the United States is. So a plural, multiple states into a single central state. And another kind of indication of that is, prior to the Civil War, people said the Union. And in the Civil War, we always hear the Union side, the South side. Nobody says the Union after the Civil War. There is no Union. Union implies different parts coming together. And now there's no different part. It's just a single nationality. No one talks about preserving the Union or the strength of the Union or the bonds of the Union. There's just the United States, singular, which is kind of strange if you think about just the United States, plural. That's how it's written. There's an S there at the end, but it's a singular thing. It's really kind of a fascinating side topic on what kind of system the United States actually has. Is it a central system? Is it a federal system? I think Boston Tea Party argues in his books that it's a central system that's set up to look like a federal system, but it's not actually. Totally side issue there. But the point is, you have these southern states that had broken away. They had formed their own government with armies and its own post office and its own foreign policy and all that. They fight this 4-year war. They lose, and now they have to get reintegrated back in. Their main social institution, slavery, has been outlawed, and they are not going to be permitted to keep their slaves in the new system. And you had, during the course of the war, the spread of you just get some genuine spread of abolitionists and what would be the term? Non-racist ideas in the North. So the North was very racist in general. They did not treat blacks equally. I think there was only 3 or 4 states where freemen could vote. and even there it would have been heavily restricted, although in general the franchise was more restricted for everyone than it was for not just for blacks but for everyone. Uh, but you did have some abolitionists in the North, obviously, who wanted to end slavery. Some abolitionists were still racist, some abolitionists were less so. Um, During the course of the war, uh, there were kind of two things going on. Once blacks from the South and from the North started fighting for the Union, forming military units and helping the army in other ways. And there were many people who thought, A, as a reward for this leal service, they should be awarded with more equal rights, with citizenship, with voting. There were other people who didn't look at it that way per se as, well, it's not a reward, but they've demonstrated through their abilities as soldiers that they are competent citizens. This was actually a big component in the ideology of slavery, was that slavery was justified because blacks were incapable of citizenship, that they lacked certain qualities that would entitle them to full treatment under the wall. They would look at them like we would look at children, basically, and say, yes, they're entitled to a certain level of, they do have a certain level of humanity, right? We do treat children, we don't just kill them flippantly, for instance, but we also don't give them equal rights. We don't allow them to vote. We don't allow them to have contracts. They're basically wards of their parents or the state. Um, I'm not saying it's akin to slavery, but it has certain actually similarities with slavery. And one of the things is they said, well, slaves can't be good soldiers. If they could be good soldiers, they would be good citizens then, and that would mean that they didn't need to be slaves. So one of the main reasons that the raising of hundreds of thousands, I think it was over 200,000 blacks fought for the North over the course of the war. One of the most powerful effects this had on the South was to show that blacks could be good soldiers. Now, we don't need to exaggerate their prowess in battle or their successes in battle, but there was no denying that they were good soldiers as well as any other units could be, and this was like literally not possible in terms of the theory of slavery as it existed in the South. There's been other types of slavery over history, which I don't think believe this. There are many slave societies where slaves were soldiers, but the chattel slavery of the American South, the way that it was developed theoretically, was that they were not capable of this. And it was something of a rebuke that, well, the North demonstrated that they were. And I made a video a couple years ago where, towards the end of the war, the South started to incorporate blacks into their military. Uh, Now, it was far too little too late. The numbers who served the Confederacy, they certainly existed. Thomas Sowell famously talks about as a young child, when he was like 5, going to his grandfather or great grandfather's funeral, I think in North Carolina or Georgia, I'm not sure. And his grandfather, African American, but was buried with full military honors, wearing his Confederate uniform. Right, so that this is a kind of a little quirk of history that's little known or a little celebrated, or maybe celebrated. It's not the right term, but um, in any event, after the war, uh, the radical Republicans uh, began talking about, okay, well, slavery's over. Now what do we do with the freemen? And they should be able to vote. We get the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, and people like Grant, obviously Lincoln was dead at this point, uh, favored the enfranchisement of blacks. And this also became a political issue because blacks in the South were going to predominantly vote Republicans, and this would give the Republicans the ability to win many southern states when they already had most of the northern states, and could lock up uh, Republican electoral victories for many years to come, at least hypothetically. Uh, and so during Reconstruction, you have the federal government coming down and basically using the military to help protect black voting rights, help protect black voters, and not just black voters and black voting rights, but white Republicans, right? You had people in the South who were not slave owners, who were not necessarily as racist as their counterparts. There were Southerners who favored black emancipation and black voting rights. Few and far between, but they did exist. There was a constituency there. Before the Civil War, there was actually a big concern that the upcountry Appalachian, non-wealthy, poor whites would form the nucleus of a Republican Party in the South. And this was actually a big fear among the planter class before the Civil War. And those people still existed after the war. And there was always the fear that they could form a non-Democrat Republican Party in the South. And that this party, especially if it united with black populations in the South, could become politically quite potent. So you have this federally enforced enfranchisement in the South. The Southerners tried to resist this. There was a lot of violence. I was aware that this violence was quite extensive. I wasn't aware how extensive. People talk about the KKK. The Klan today and in the 20th century does not compare to what the Klan was doing in the late 1860s and early 1870s. We're talking about thousands of homicides per year per state in some states like Louisiana, Mississippi, where the level of terror and coercion that they inflicted on, again, blacks and white Republicans was astounding. And you had a situation where then white juries would refuse to convict, white prosecutors and judges would refuse to bring indictments, and you had many situations where even the governors, the Republican governors of these states, were helpless to kind of control the violence. And it's easy to look at this and just say, hey, look, see, the federal government has come and they're imposing this more egalitarian democracy onto these southern states, these recalcitrant, racist, KKK, literally, states. And isn't it great? Uncle Sam has come down and kind of, through the power of the federal arsenal and the federal army, with Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman and other generals, to force black enfranchisement and force democracy. Isn't this a good thing? Well, it does raise ethical questions, because you had situations with federal troops storming state houses and kicking out the Democrats and then having new votes, right, based on that, which didn't look very good in the press. But what is lost is that the motivation of the North was a nationalist motivation. The love of blacks, the love of equality, was a minority motivation. All right, there were abolitionists who did feel that way, but very few. Wendell Phillips and William Lloyd Garrison and their ilk, but not many beyond that. And for those people, for the majority of the people who filled the armies of the Republic that invaded the South, they weren't that interested in black voting rights. In fact, if anything, they'd probably be happy if blacks weren't voting. And they certainly didn't want to have to continue to occupy the South for a cause they didn't really believe in. So in the book, he makes it clear that Grant really did believe, as far as he can tell, in black voting rights, that he thought that they had earned the right to be citizens, that they had acquitted themselves well in the war, and that they were born in the U.S. and that they should have all the rights of the citizens in the rest of the country. And he attempted to use the military to force this onto the South. And this became a political liability for the Republican Party. The Republican Party started as not as an abolitionist party, but as a party that was dedicated to, in some way, addressing the problem of slavery. People kind of get this wrong and assume this means the Republicans wanted to end slavery. Well, there were a few who did. Most were more moderate, and they just wanted to do something about it, stop it spreading their territories, stuff like that. Maybe work towards gradual emancipation, but there weren't that many who were outright calling for an end to slavery. But of course, once slavery's over, the purpose of the Republican Party, of its formation, is no longer there, and so the party has to make a shift, and it starts to become more the nationalistic party of business and less the party of abolition, which was no longer necessary. Uh, so in the book, it gets to be 1875, 1876, and you get this pivotal moment when uh, the governor of Mississippi calls Grant, telegraphs Grant, says, the Klan is terrorizing our constituents. They're killing people by the hundreds. They're terrorizing the state house. We can't have a fair election. Please send federal troops down to help, you know, restore order, which is something they had done earlier, right? They had suppressed the Klan in other situations. They had done other things. There had been the political will to do this to a point. Uh, and Grant was about to do it when Rutherford B. Hayes, the then Republican governor of Ohio, went to Grant and said, listen, among the Republicans in Ohio, this is not popular anymore. The Republicans in Ohio are not voting for Republicans so that they can send federal troops into Mississippi to support black voting rights. They just don't care that much about it. They're more interested in, say, financial issues or tariff issues or any host of other priorities. And if you continue to pursue this policy, we're going to lose votes in Ohio, and we could lose Ohio. And Grant said that he felt, out of party loyalty to the Republican Party, that he should then not help stop the voter suppression in Mississippi. And so he didn't. And the voter suppression in Mississippi went on. And within a few years, the South went from having, a large amount of African American representation and representatives, senators, whatever, to a single party, solid white, the solid South, as people say, the solid Democrat, solid white. Didn't happen overnight. It took a couple years, but not too many. And this is, and then famously, in 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, this aforementioned governor of Ohio, ran for president. He lost the popular vote to the Democrat Tilden. So those of you who remember the 2000 election, the 1876 election was recalled many times for this reason, because Hayes did not win the popular vote. It looked like he was going to lose the Electoral College as well, but there were three southern states that were very close: South Carolina, Mississippi, and Georgia or Alabama. Getting that last one wrong. And there was apparently an understanding reached where Hayes said, okay, if the state officials in those states declare that Hayes is the winner in those states, he will win the Electoral College by one vote. And if they do that, he would be willing to end Reconstruction. He would end the federal occupation of the South. He would end the prosecutions of the Klan. He would end basically any kind of federal involvement in helping with the voting rights of blacks. And the Southerners, that was their ultimate goal, that they would be willing to endure a Republican presidency if it meant getting the return of white power in the South. And so they agreed, and Hayes won the election. And this is not exactly a conspiracy theory. This is actually pretty well admitted. You can look it up. The 1876 election of Hayes over Tilden. And this is a very important part of history that is omitted, basically, from, not like in a sense that it's wiped from history books. It's just not included. People know about the Civil War, and that's it. And so people have this view of the federal government like it's this benevolent force for good, this altruistic force that swoops in from Washington to save minorities. And it's true that it's very powerful, and if it sees it within its interests, it is possible for it to do something that's quote unquote good. But it's important to understand that when it does that, it's because it sees it as being self-motivated, right? That it has a selfish reason to do that. It had a selfish reason to emancipate the slaves, to stop this insurrection by slave owners, right? You have this huge, massive insurrection by slave owners. Most of their labor was being committed by slaves, so they emancipate slaves. And they, if for the, it's kind of an inside joke, but if the Emancipation Proclamation specifically doesn't emancipate slaves who are not in the rebelling South, it excluded all of Tennessee and it excluded the areas of Virginia and of Louisiana that had been occupied by the North. It exempted the slaves of any Southerners who stopped rebelling and returned to the Union before January 1st, 1863. So yes, it freed slaves in that context, and then it supported black voting rights to a point. But as soon as their own electoral power was threatened by taking that moral stance, they backed off immediately, right? As soon as Reconstruction was no longer politically palatable, they backed off. And, you know, you can argue about if that's ethically evil for them to have backed off or not. But what you can't say is that these are clearly that the federal government is clearly this beacon of moral righteousness. It clearly was self-interested. The members, and this is, I think, an important point. It's not like this was an accidental, uh, flippant decision on the part of Grant or of Hayes. Grant probably sincerely believed in black voting rights and democracy and all that. Uh, but the logic of political power trumps ethics. It trumps morality. If you need to win the next election, then that is going to figure very prominently in your thinking, whatever it is that you need to do that. And that's what we had going on with Reconstruction. We had this situation where, to a point, it was beneficial to the Republicans who were ruling the federal government. Uh, and once that threshold was passed and it was no longer in their political interest to do it, they dropped it. When as soon as it became in their political interest to uh, allow for the South to close ranks and become a segregated pro-white Klan terrorist state, Jim Crow, all that, then they did. And that was that for the next 60 years. And people say, wow, now you're omitting the civil rights era. Well, it was a different era. So Southerners in the 1960s were not nearly as willing or as violent as they were in the 1860s and 70s to resist blacks, right? So there were murders, there were lynchings. Not diminishing that or denying that, but the scale, even though the population was larger, was nowhere even remotely close. Right, so the number of people in the South who were willing to go out at night and actually kill blacks and actually kill their white supporters as a fraction of the population was minuscule in comparison. Um, and in the 1960s than it was or the 1950s than it was in the 1860s and 1870s. And the interests of the federal government were different in the 1960s than they were before. It was also a voting issue. Oh, these are black votes. We can buy black votes this way. So I think Reconstruction is, you know, for if you read about the Civil War, you should read about Reconstruction, just as you should study the antebellum period as well, right? If you are only gonna, you're just not doing enough if you read a book on the Civil War and that's it. You need to know about the before and you need to know about the after. And if you don't, then you can become very susceptible to these truncated, what Robert Hicks calls truncating the antecedents. You can omit parts of the story to create a fundamentally different narrative. We do this all the time with the War on Terror, which starts on September 11th, 2001, right? There was no history prior to that, and that's the beginning. And as pivotal as an important event as that is, unprecedented in so many ways, and while it might make sense stylistically or narratively to maybe write a book that begins with that or ends with that, fine. I'm not going to uh, say that any author or writer or whatever who makes that decision is uh, necessarily wrong for the context of what they're doing. But in your analysis of the who, what, when, where, and why, if that's all you're going to go on, you're going to have a completely warped understanding of reality. And that's what we have uh, when people talk about the Civil War and about the U.S. federal government. Um, it's complicity and duplicity uh, in the lead-ups to these events. Its role in the spreading slavery through the Fugitive Slave Law, through the Dred Scott case, through the slave trade, through the suppression of slave revolts or the implied suppression of slave revolts. You know, it was interesting in the book too. He talks about a lot of these blacks in the South. They did arm themselves. They did form black militias, right? They did not want to be victimized, and they armed themselves. And yet, this was largely negated by the fact that if it ever came to shooting, there was no doubt that the federal government would come down on the side of the whites. And Grant talked about that. He goes, look, if the Klan can murder hundreds of blacks and it barely makes any noise whatsoever, but if one white person gets harmed by a black person, there's outrage everywhere. And if and this was understood by blacks, right? At the end of the day, if they stood their ground and fired, then the federal government is coming to crush them, not the people who attacked them. And that was the reality of slavery all along. It would have been easy to think if you lived in South Carolina or Mississippi, hey, we're a majority. One night we could kill half the masters and boom, we'd be free. Well, no, you could do that. And then a month later or 2 weeks later, however long it would be, armies paid for and manned from the entire country, including from the north, would sweep down and mercilessly crush the revolt. And there was absolutely no question about that. And that's why, when the South initially left, there are plenty of abolitionists who were quite happy. They'd even called for that. William Lloyd Garrison for years had said, he called for, quote, no union with the slave power. Why should we be subsidizing slavery by uniting our power with it? Which is what they were doing. And there were plenty of people in the South who actually opposed secession because they thought, hey, the federal government is the greatest protector of slavery that ever existed. We have this vast hinterland where slavery isn't technically allowed, but where slaves can't go without fear of being caught and returned, where it's criminal to aid them, and where there's this non-slave owning population however, who are taxed and who could be conscripted. Well, conscription wasn't really practiced before the Civil War, but who would uh, be available as a manpower pool to suppress any nascent servile uprisings should they have happened. Now, as it turned out, there were not many servile uprisings in the United States. There were some. Most of them were not very big. I mean, we're talking about dozens or hundreds of people involved, not thousands and thousands. Uh, but a big part of that was how difficult that would have been. Uh, I don't know how much slaves understood that or not. I'm sure some did and some didn't. So I don't want to speculate. But the people in the South definitely knew. Hey, if there was actually a slave insurrection, Uncle Sam is going to come to the rescue. And even after the Civil War, when you're talking about the Klan, who are former Confederates, right? People who had actively rebelled against the federal government, who had killed Northerners. Some of them had killed Northerners by the hundreds or thousands. Right? These are people that Northerners should be happy to crack down on again. And yet, when they fight blacks, when they fight loyal Republican Federalist blacks, the vast majority of the white North is going to side with the racist white secesh South, not the pro-union, pro-Republican blacks. And Grant actually, he quotes Grant in the book as talking about the irony of that. Uh, and yet that was the reality, that uh, federal power was never going to be used even-handedly or fairly. And uh, as soon as the political winds blew the right direction, they dropped the blacks in the South like nobody's business, and they remained in a state of peonage for the next 80 years. Shelby Foote again argues that in many ways it was worse than slavery because they weren't property, nobody was obligated to take care of them. It was basically open season on them. Now, that's debatable if that was better or worse. At the very least, they could leave, and many of them did, uh, to conditions in the North that, whatever their many faults, were apparently better because many people made the decision to make the move. Um, but uh, yeah, I think that so much of our history and our zeitgeist is based on these little fairy tales that aren't lies necessarily. It's not false that the Emancipation Proclamation happened or that slavery ended at the end of the Civil War with the 13th Amendment. Those are all true things that really happened. And it's also true that there were abolitionists in the North and that there were people who believed in abolition and there were people who believed in black voting rights. And those people, they had a thrilling time in their first half of the 1860s. But it's also true that when push came to shove, political power, political corruption, if you want to call it that, ultimately was what was determining what was and was not happening. And as long as your virtue is aligned with that, it's fine. And as soon as what you want is not aligned with that, then you're SOL. And that's what happened to blacks. And I think it's a disservice to what they went through, to the reality of their existence, to pretend like Uncle Sam was this big Santa Claus that came and gave them their freedom, and we all lived happily ever after. They were pawns, by and large, in a suppression of a rebellion. Uh, the federal government was happy to free them as a punishment on rebellious subjects, and to use them as soldiers, dare I say cannon fodder, uh, although there isn't really evidence that they were used as cannon fodder any more than whites were. Um, but then when the war was over and the main objective was had, and ending slavery was not the main objective, subduing the South and forcing it back into union was the main objective. Once that was achieved, then yes, there was gratitude, and yes, there was talk of bettering their lives, but this was of much less importance and significance than other considerations. And getting along again with the South was more important than helping out blacks, to the minds of the vast majority of people in the North, and indeed in the minds, at least to the point that they took action of the people in the government. So, anyway, it's a great book for anyone interested in the history, not just of the Civil War, but of the surrounding period. Grant is a fascinating character, and all in all, a fairly laudatory one in a lot of ways. There's lots of stuff in there that I didn't realize about his presidency, for instance. Um, and I think biography is a really good way to get that kind of overview without ending the narrative at Appomattox or with the assassination of Lincoln. It makes sense to, I mean, I get it why you would end a book on the Civil War with those topics, or larger books will usually have some kind of epilogue that goes into more details about the end. When was the last skirmish? When was the last person who died? When did they catch Jeff Davis? Blah, blah, blah. But it usually ends there, and it's like that's not the story didn't end. It continued. never ended. It's still going on. So anyway, I will talk to you all later. Bye bye.